Every day, we live under the constant assault of thoughts and ideas. And over time, we've started to believe innocent lies. And now, our lives are as fragile as shifting sand. Welcome to Lies I Believe.
Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to Grace. I'm so glad that you joined us for worship today. For those of you who made a commitment at the beginning of this year to prioritize your relationship with God by engaging with a local church, I just want to encourage you today. You're 3 weeks in, and you're doing great. I've just seen God honor those kinds of steps of faith in the past, so keep it up. And this month, we're shining a light on some of the most common lies that people believe, and particularly lies about God and about faith and about the spiritual life in general. And so in week one, we looked at the lie that says, God just wants me to be happy. And then last week, we explored the very popular lie that says, I can do it on my own. And today I want to talk about a lie that has really eternal implications, especially among people who call themselves Christians. Now, let me set this up by sharing a recent statistic. In 2020, the Cultural Resource Center led a study called the American Worldview Inventory 2020 survey. And the study found that 52% of people who describe themselves as Christians believe in a works-oriented means of getting to heaven. That means over half of Christians believe that God's love can be earned by performing enough good works. Len Munsell, the president of the overseeing organization, responded to these results, and I just want to quote him here. He says, the lack of understanding of basic Christian theology is stunning, with potentially devastating consequences for individual souls and really for all aspects of American life and culture. It's a wake-up call for the church and for leaders in all areas of influence to speak, to teach, and work to restore biblical truth. He went on to say that many souls will be lost if people are misled by the false notion that we can earn our way to heaven, rather than recognizing the truth that Christ alone and his righteousness are the basis for our salvation. So, the lie we're dealing with today says, I'll get to heaven by being a good person. And as we've been doing each week, I want to identify some underlying lies about God and about you and me that contribute to this bigger lie. So first, the lie about God is that God's love must be earned. You know, we're used to having to earn all affection and appreciation, doing something and then getting some commensurate response back for a job well done. So when we work a 40-hour week and receive fair pay for our time, that's a wage. Or when we compete in athletics and we receive a trophy, that's a prize. And when we receive recognition at work for long service or achievement, that's an award. But true salvation, according to the Bible, is none of those things. You see, when we are incapable of earning a wage and don't earn a prize and don't deserve a reward, yet we receive a gift anyway, that's called grace. It's a free gift. Paul says in Ephesians 2:8-9, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. So a contributing lie is this idea that God's love must be earned. That's clearly not the case, nor is it possible, but we're going to get there in a second. There's also a lie about me embedded here in this bigger lie. The lie is that my eternal worth is based on my moral performance. So some people think that if I could grip my teeth and clench my fists and try with all my might, I can be good enough to earn my way to heaven. Not only is this impossible, but attempting it will lead to a life of miserable frustration, because you will always feel like you don't measure up. And the reason is you don't. So here's the truth, and it's also today's big idea, and it's that only Jesus is good enough to secure you a place in heaven. Jesus alone has the authority and the power and the access and the forgiveness and the standing to secure that spot for you. But before we come back to kind of build that out, I want to talk to you about the problem with being a good person. Here's the problem. You are not good when compared to God. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm a big fan of being a good person. I'll be the first one to lead a parade to reclaim some common human decency in our society. Being a good person is a very good idea. What I'm talking about here is, if your plan when you die is to approach God and say, God, check out this list of all the good stuff I've done, and this is why you should let me into heaven, it's going to be very clear on that day that you've been measuring yourself by the wrong ruler. God's standard of goodness is different than what you and I can accomplish. His measure of goodness is based on himself, which is perfection. And you and I can never get there. See, the thing about the word good is that it's a relative term. When someone says, I'm a good person, the truth of that statement completely depends on who they're comparing themselves to. I was meeting with a new mom one time who brought her baby to the meeting with her. The little baby was strapped into one of those car seats and was grabbing kind of that carry bar and trying to pull himself up. And the mom said to me in true new mom fashion, "Can you believe how strong he is?" Now, I didn't want to hurt her feelings, but my first thought was, strong compared to who? Like by almost any commonly accepted definition of the word strong, that pipsqueak didn't qualify. I was like, let me arm wrestle that little punk and I'll show you who's strong and then let you rethink your words. No, I'm really not that rude, I promise you. But you get my point. The question is, strong compared to whom? And if he's only strong compared to other 3-month-olds, that's fine. But in the real world, that's actually not strong at all. The word loses meaning, just like the word good. I've told this story before, but when I was a teenager, I had dreams of playing in the NFL. I thought I was a pretty good football player. Like at the high school level, I was a good player, and I was being recruited to play in college. And I thought, that I'd be able to play in the pros one day. In fact, when I watched the NFL games on Sunday afternoons on our little black and white TV, I would say to myself, I think I can play with those guys. Like, look at those little figures running around on that TV screen. They don't look that much faster than me or stronger than me or bigger than me. I think I can play on their level. And then in 1988, I went on a mission trip to Mexico with the youth group. On the last leg of the trip, on the way home, we were flying from Chicago to Buffalo. And on that flight, I had the privilege of sitting next to the starting center for the Buffalo Bills. His name was Kent Hull. Why he was riding coach, I'm not sure, but he was there and he was already seated by the time that I took my seat next to him. And he was friendly and everything was going great on the flight until Kent decided that he needed to get something out of the overhead compartment. And when he stood up, my NFL dreams died. I sat there and beheld his enormity. He was about 6'5", 300 pounds. And I knew in that instant I would never, ever play professional football. What looked to be a little person on a TV screen at a distance was a hulking giant of a man. And I knew that I never belonged on the same field with him. He was in a different league entirely. That's the day my NFL dreams died. I may have been good at football in a very narrow definition of the word good, but when compared to the best, I was nothing. I needed to choose a different word. So when you say, I belong in heaven because I'm a good person, this same kind of deception is involved because one day you're going to stand face to face with absolute holiness, absolute perfection, absolute righteousness. And there will be no doubt on that day that there is only one good person in the room. You see, at a distance, we can be fooled into thinking that we're pretty good, like compared to Hitler or Mussolini or the jerk of neighbor that I got. But God is not measuring goodness on that scale. He is the standard of goodness. And the closer we get to God, the more we understand how far short we fall. You will only think you're a good person until God walks in the room, at which time you'll know that you are something completely different. Your version of good is just not good enough. Isaiah 64:6 tells us that all our righteous deeds are like filthy rags. This means that if you think your ticket to heaven is your good deeds, like you're planning to plead your case by saying, God, I went to church 3,252 times. I gave $20,000 to the poor during my lifetime. I memorized the book of James, whatever it is. Those things are fine and good, but they're not going to be the grand achievement before God like you hope they are. In fact, when you hold those things up, it's going to be like holding up filthy rags as your big trophy. We're in different leagues. Listen to these sobering words from Jesus in Matthew 7:21-23. He says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not, listen now, prophesy in your name? Did we not cast out demons in your name? Do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Now, What are these people doing? They're giving Jesus their list of good works, their spiritual accomplishments. And listen, it's a pretty good list. They're saying, we prophesied, like we cast out demons. We did many mighty works. That's big time. I've never done some of that stuff. And they said it only to hear the most terrifying, unexpected verdict at the end of their lives. When Jesus says, depart from me, I never knew you. You see, the problem with being a good person is that you're not good enough compared to God. So I want to go to our main text today and to make sense of it. It's over in Colossians 1, 21 and 23 if you want to follow along. I mean, if we're not getting into heaven by being a good person, how is it that we gain access? So I want to start in Colossians 1, 21. Paul says this. He says, once you were alienated from God, and you were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. So what I want you to see from this text today is two admissions that provide the keys to heaven. Here's the first one, is to admit that sin has ruined your chance to be good enough for heaven. Like any true encounter with God that leads to salvation begins with a humble admission of our fallenness. Like when Isaiah sees this vision of God in Isaiah 6, his first response was, woe is me, I am unclean. Or like when Peter and the disciples, when they finally saw Jesus for who he was, it says they fell to their knees and they said, depart from us, we are sinners. So true salvation doesn't say I can do it. True salvation admits I can't do it, but Jesus can. And I really believe, guys, that this provides a key insight into our human condition. You know, Christianity says that the biggest problem for all of us is that we've been ravaged by sin. The popular cultural view is that people are basically and inherently good, and they occasionally do bad things. So you'll hear Oprah and Ellen and Ryan Seacrest or whoever telling people, just follow your heart. Like be true to yourself or find your voice. Why? Because we're inherently good. And that sounds really nice. But if that were true, I think we'd be living in a far different world than we're living in. Like if all people are inherently good, at some point that collective goodness of all of us is going to win the day and our world would be getting much better and better. And I'm not sure any of us would say that that worldview matches our actual reality. Most of us would say our world seems to be getting actually worse and worse. It's why I think the Bible's assessment is much more accurate. The Bible says that you're not a good person who occasionally does bad things. You're a sinful person who occasionally does good things. Let me stress that the Bible also affirms that each person has inherent value and inherent worth because every human being is made in the image of God and deserves dignity and respect. But it also acknowledges the presence of a sin nature in every one of us. Some of you are still struggling with this because that cultural view has been so deeply ingrained. And so let me press the issue for just a moment. If our culture's view is true, and if you are at your core inherently good, like that's what comes most naturally to you is to be good, then why don't you just be good all the time? Like if your anger gets you in trouble every time, then just stop being angry. If your lust is getting you in trouble, stop lusting. If you're inherently good, why not be consistently good? Just choose to stop all the bad behaviors that get you in trouble. If financial habits have screwed up your life and you're in debt, then just stop doing that. If you're struggling with anxiety or depression, just choose not to be those things. Make it easy for your therapist. Just make your appointment, walk in, tell them all the things you've done wrong, have them look back at you and say, stop doing those things, and hand them $120 and be done with it. Just stop being bad. You already know how the bad things get you in trouble, the things that cause you scars. If you're at your core a good person, just be good all the time, because that's what will come most naturally to you. But why isn't it that simple? Why don't we all just get together and decide to be good and obey the golden rule and eliminate all the evils of the world, hunger and abuse and trafficking and greed? Why don't we just get together and agree to be who we are? Because in your mind right now, most of you know, and you're saying in your head, that will never happen. Why? Because we're not all naturally good at our core. Just the opposite. At our core, we all struggle with an inherent sin nature that plagues us. We need freed from it. We need rescued from it. Like there's something deep inside you that causes you to run right past better judgment. It causes you to run right past common sense and morals and convictions, and runs right past being a good example to your kids. And you just want to go do that thing anyway, even though you know it will hurt you. And so you do it and you regret it and then you do it again. See, you and I have a problem that runs very deep. We are sinners. And we're not just sinners because we sin, but it's born into us. It's a sin nature. It's coursing through our DNA from our very first parents, Adam and Eve. And so you lust and you're jealous and you talk bad about people and you fly into fits of rage and you overspend and you exaggerate and you get your priorities screwed up and you yell at your kids and you don't respect your parents. Sin, you see, is our greatest problem. And we see its effects all over our world. And so Colossians 1:21 says that the result of this sin is twofold. That sin has rendered you alienated from God. That's a scary place. Even scarier still, it rendered you enemies of God. This describes the state of every person who has ever lived. We've all been distanced from God because of our sin. And you notice from that verse that it's both a mind problem and a behavior problem. Sin is rebellion against God. And we can see it all around us, and in our more honest moments, we recognize that it's also in us. And before we get to the really good news, I just want to drive the point home a little bit more and outline just 5 devastating truths about sin. Here's the first. Sin will pursue you. Like a rabid dog, it will catch you and it will pull you down. Genesis 4:7 says that sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you. Listen, someone needs to be reminded today that sin is after you. It's not passive, it's active. Maybe you felt it all week. You've been considering something that a month ago or a year ago you never would have considered. You're about to do the unthinkable. Listen, this is your chance to stop and to say, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to plunge my family into that. I'm not going to walk off in that direction. This is your time, but sin is pursuing you. Second, sin will trip you up. Hebrews 12:1 says that sin so easily ensnares us. It's like setting traps for an animal in the woods. You think I was doing fine. I thought I had that attitude in check, or I thought I had that behavior under control. And then before you knew it, you fell flat on your face and your heart was filled with bitterness, or you're still carrying unforgiveness or anger about something that you thought you'd already let go of. You found yourself saying something you swore you'd never say again. Sin will trip you up, often when you least expect it. Here's the third devastating truth. It's that sin will disappoint you. Hebrews 11:25 says that the pleasures of sin are for a season. You know, you've heard me say it before, but when people try to be all spiritual with me and they'll tell me, Pastor, I don't even desire to sin anymore. I usually say, bro, you're doing it wrong. Like, sin is enjoyable, yes. But the caveat is only for a season. Time will always run out on it. Sin will never give you what it promises. It will always lead you to a place you didn't want to go. And in the end, it'll leave you emptier than you ever were before. The fourth truth is this, that sin will expose you. Like, you may think that your sin is a secret, that no one's ever going to find out. It's hidden safely away. And in front of others, you know how to play the game. You know how to handle things. You know how to get away with it. You've become an expert at hiding and faking. But it will come out. And it will usually come out at the worst possible time because Satan loves to maximize the devastation. He wants to destroy you. Numbers 32 says that be sure your sin will find you out. The last and most devastating truth is that sin will destroy you. Our passage here in Colossians says that sin has made you an enemy of God, the worst possible place to be. Romans 6:23 says it clearly. It says the wages of sin is death. So sin leads to death. It will ultimately destroy you. It's a fundamental problem that we cannot solve ourselves. And the beginning of understanding what God has done for you in Christ stems from an understanding of what sin is. Sin is not an oops. Sin is not a trifle, it's a tragedy. Sin is not a falling, it's a fatality. It's not a curiosity, it's a cancer. And it's growing in the center of your life's purpose. And without Christ, it will take you down. It will take you out of this world and into an eternity separated from God. It will destroy you. Now, with the truth of all of that on display, you can see how ridiculous it is to say, I'm going to heaven because I'm a good person. No, sin has rendered that impossible. This is the first admission that sin has ruined my chance to be good enough for heaven. And listen, I get that this is hard to admit. In fact, I know that it's much easier to see how everyone else isn't good enough than it is to apply this to myself. It's easy to see sin out there. It's much harder to see sin in the mirror. Some years ago, I found out that one of my kids was misbehaving in the church's kids choir. He wasn't standing when he was supposed to stand. He wasn't singing when he was supposed to sing. In fact, he was mouthing the word watermelon over and over again so no one could tell if he was singing or not. And what was worse is that he's a leader, and so he was gaining a little following with some of the other kids, forming a gang of rebellion at the church choir. Well, I flipped out a lot. Like there's already the whole pastor's kid stigma that we have to overcome. Well, about a week later in prayer, I realized that my anger was much more about me than it was about him. I was much more concerned about what people were thinking of me as a father, as a pastor, than trying to get at the heart of what was going on in him. You see, sin was way easier to see in him and much harder to see in me. It's one of the deceptive powers of sin. But until it becomes personal, like until you're humble enough and self-aware enough to look in the mirror, until you're wounded with the reality that you are a sinner in need of salvation, your life is going to be frustrating because you'll be living as one alienated from God and an enemy of God. So Colossians 1:21 says, once you were alienated from God and you were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. I want you to get ready for two beautiful words, okay? Two amazing words, two redemptive and life-changing and glorious words in Colossians 1:22. Paul says, but now. Like that was true. It was true. That used to be true. Like earlier in my life, that was my fate. But now, and look what he says, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. If you continue in your faith, established and firm, not moved from the hope held out in the gospel. And this is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven. So here's the second admission that provides the keys to heaven. It's to admit that only Jesus' sacrifice will qualify you for heaven. Did you catch the beautiful declaration? He has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight. And listen to how he'll present you. Without blemish and free from accusation. You see, Jesus' work on the cross accomplished what your good works could never accomplish. And that is right standing with God. You can't work your way towards it. You can't earn your way into it. And as we said at the beginning, there's no wage to be earned, no prize to be won, no award deserved. It is a free gift of grace. Salvation is something done for you. You just need to receive it and let it overwhelm and reorient your life. Athanasius, the 4th century early church father, called what was accomplished on the cross the glorious exchange. That there was a trade that was made on Calvary's Hill, and we got the much better end of the deal. Listen to the way that this trade is described in 2 Corinthians 5:21. It says, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. That's the exchange. Let's look at the details of the exchange. Exchange number one is that your sin goes to Jesus. You see, the cross of Christ is deeply personal. Because on that cross, Jesus bore every instance of your sin, every instance of your lying, of your cheating, of your stealing, gossiping, slandering, jealousy, rage, anger, your gluttony, your idolatry, your hatred, your greed, your bitterness, your grudges, your envy, your pride, your self-righteousness, your lust, your laziness, your arrogance, your profanity, your hypocrisy, your drunkenness, your bigotry, your sexual immorality, your dissension, your bickering, your discord, your lewdness, your unwholesome talk, your abuse, your ungratefulness, your cowardice. And listen, those are just some of the things that we do. Imagine if I were to list all the things that we think, or all the attitudes that we have, or all the good things that we should do that we leave undone. Like, so Jesus on the cross, his feet were pierced for the sins of your feet, and his hands were pierced for the sins of your hands, and his side was pierced for the sins of your heart, and his head was pierced for the sins of your mind. Has it ever really hit you that Jesus knew all of you, and he died for all of you? Like he knew you would become powerless to overcome your own struggles without his sacrifice and his death and his resurrection, and so he went willingly to the cross. So guys, Jesus was not just a good man who had some wise teachings who died an unfortunate death. Jesus is the only hope you've got. The only hope for a life with meaning on this side of the grave, and the only hope for life everlasting on the other side of it. So exchange number one is that your sin goes to Jesus. But here's the crazy part. It's exchange number two is that Jesus' righteousness goes to you. So that when God looks at you, he doesn't see your sin. He doesn't see your shortcomings. He doesn't see your shame. He sees the righteousness of his perfect son, Jesus, applied to you. So our passage said that he sees you without blemish and free from accusation, which means not only does God pardon your sin and give you a get out of jail free card, he also pins a medal of honor on your chest that wasn't earned by you, but was earned by Jesus. And he treats you as if you had done everything that Jesus had ever done. It's a beautiful exchange. See, the only good deed that's required to enter heaven is the good deed of Jesus on the cross. Your Sunday school perfect attendance pin isn't going to do it. Only the sacrifice of Jesus could do it. In a sermon from 2019, Pastor Alistair Begg articulates this truth so perfectly that I'm just going to quote him here and just to drive this home. If I could use a Scottish accent, I would do it. He posed this scenario about how you would answer this question. It's the very question of my message today and the lie that we're correcting today. The question is, if you were to die tonight and to try to gain entry into heaven, what would you say? He says, if you answer that in the first person, you've immediately gone wrong. Like if you start your answer, because I believed, because I have faith, because I did this, because I achieved that. No, the only proper answer begins in the third person. It's because he. And then he says, think about that thief on the cross. Like, I can't wait to find that guy one day and ask him, like, how did that shake out for you? Because you were cussing Jesus out with your friend. You've never been in a Bible study. You never got baptized. You didn't know a thing about church membership, nothing about theology. And yet, you made it. How did you make it? The angel at the gate must have said, what are you doing here? The man says, I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? He says, I don't know. The angel says, no, excuse me, let me go get my supervisor. They go get the supervisor angel. He says, okay, well, I just got a few questions for you. First of all, are you clear on the doctrine of justification by faith? The guy says, I've never heard of it in my life. He says, well, what about the doctrine of Scripture? We need to start there. This has to be settled. And the guy's just staring off into space. Eventually the angel says, in frustration, on what basis are you here? And he simply says in response, the man on the middle cross said I can come. And that's the only answer. And if you don't acknowledge that, and if you will just keep living as if your salvation depends on you. And listen, as soon as you go there, it's going to lead to either abject despair because you will work yourself to the bone trying your hardest and it won't be enough. Or it will lead to a horrible kind of arrogance where you actually think that you're blowing God's mind by how great of a prize you are to him and his kingdom. It is only the cross of Christ that deals both with the dreadful despair and the pretentious arrogance because we're not saved by good works. We are saved only as a result of what Christ has achieved. So today we've addressed a very common lie, the one that says, I can get to heaven by being a good person. And hopefully you've been convinced that only Jesus is good enough to secure your place in heaven. You know, we've talked about these two key admissions, admitting that sin has ruined your chance at being good enough and admitting that only Jesus' sacrifice can qualify you for heaven. And I hope, I pray that this has been soul arresting for those of you who are Christians. Maybe you walked in as one of the 52% from the survey earlier that has slipped into the unbiblical belief that you are somehow earning your salvation. Hopefully you have plenty to chew on today and to rethink. But I want to turn my attention to those of you who find yourself wrestling with new information right now. Maybe you're not a Christian at all when you walked in here and you're hearing this all for the first time. Or maybe you grew up in the church, but it didn't really stick. You never really knew this side of things. Or maybe honestly, this is old information that you've heard before, but you're seeing it now in a new light. I want to address you for just a moment as I close and provide a chance for you to respond. You know, the Bible indicates that between the day that we're born and the day that we die, all of us have to make a decision about the sacrifice of Jesus. And there are really only a few options. It's to reject it, to ignore it, or to receive it. But if he really did die, like if this really did happen, and he died on a cross as he predicted, and he supernaturally left a tomb, and he left it empty over in the middle of the outside of Jerusalem, we all need to reckon with that event. And your hopes of heaven, listen, are pinned to that sacrifice and to that event. So I'm going to invite you to a decision today to receive his sacrifice. Will you surrender to his love and lordship? Will you forfeit your straining and striving to be good enough and receive his grace through a great exchange? And listen, guys, there's nothing magical that happens in this moment. It's a first step on a journey. But any journey worth taking requires a first step. And the cool thing is that this first step is from death to life. Like Jesus can take your guilt and your shame and your worst moment, and in your soul that has fallen asleep, he can awaken his forgiveness for you. And for some of you, it's time. I want you to know that God loves you. I want you to know that he has a relationship. He wants a relationship with you, that he's here right now to forgive you and to give you a whole new lease on life. The Bible's clear that nobody was born a Christian. Jesus said you have to be born again. You have to come to him and say, Lord, I'm a sinner. I believe you died for me. You're the Savior. Please come and forgive me of all my sins. He would love to do that for you today. He would love to cover you with his grace and his mercy. And listen, there are a bunch of prodigals out there. Maybe you're watching on TV. Maybe you're watching online today. Like you haven't been to church in a while. Guess what? In early 2022, God saw fit in his sovereign grace to have the church come to you. And man, if that's you today, or if you're at one of our locations, I want to urge you to take a simple but profoundly important step of faith. Your host is going to come now and walk you through that. Don't wait another day to respond to the incredible love of God. I love you guys.